Recently, I talked about some good builds to play in Path of Exile 3.19. I tried to discuss both things that were very popular and commonly known about, along with some things that are less known, maybe played a bit less in softcore trade, but are still really good builds. And today I'm going to be doing much the same, except I'm going to highlight some builds from solo self-found, hardcore, and solo self-found, while also talking about the broader meta for these game modes. To start off with, a little bit of difference between the three game modes. Solo self-found is very good if you're looking for budget builds. Oftentimes, you'll see budget as clickbait in the title of a build guide, and it might be budget, it might not. On the other hand, if you look especially at solo self-found week 1 on Pewee Ninja, you know it's budget, because they're using whatever junk they found on the floor and whatever they managed to craft on very limited resources. Furthermore, a lot of these early solo self-found builds in particular tend to have more rares and less uniques, or if they do have uniques, those uniques are very farmable. Hardcore, on the other hand, is good to research tanky builds, but it can be a little bit overkill. The reason that hardcore builds are such overkill defensively is the simple principle of YODO, or you only die once. In softcore trade, most people would consider dying once every 100 maps a build that's super tanky. In hardcore, that means you only get to do about 100 maps. And then solo self-found hardcore combines needing overkill defenses with extremely limited resources. As a result, I wouldn't suggest that you look at solo self-found hardcore builds unless you're specifically looking to play solo self-found hardcore. This is a very limited environment. It requires overkill defenses and a lot of adaptation and personal skill. However, if you ever want to check out the Gauntlet, then you should definitely check out solo self-found hardcore builds, as those will be most similar to what you're playing in the Gauntlet. So what are the metas for solo self-found, hardcore, and solo self-found hardcore? We're seeing a lot of the usual candidates, skills like Righteous Fire, Lightning Conduit, and Spectral Helix. These are all good because they have the ability to scale damage really easily. Righteous Fire scales off of gem level and your health. Lightning Conduit just has absurd numbers as long as you can shock things, aka you're playing an Elementalist, and Spectral Helix just hits really hard and can multi-hit enemies. Spectral Helix is also super versatile, so it can be played on a lot of different ascendancies, including Assassin, Occultist, Trickster, Champion, Raider, and much more. Plus, it appeals to a lot of different playstyles, Fizz, Ellie, or even Poison. The big thing to keep in mind here is all of these builds scale really well without much gear, and additionally, the defenses are either very strong and synergize with how the skill does damage, or in the case of something like Spectral Helix or Lightning Conduit, it does so much damage that all you have to really build on your character is defenses. Some other skills that seem to be showing up a lot in the meta are SRS, Explosive Arrow, and Bone Shatter. SRS is one that I actually talked about in my previous video, where I was looking at softcore trade builds, and since then Valor Mage has released a really good video talking about his experiences with SRS. Both will be in the video card right now if you want to check them out for yourself. EA is, well, EA. It got nerfed, but that doesn't mean it isn't super viable still. And Bone Shatter is melee with self-damage. It has incredibly high damage scaling, and you need to be tanky to survive your own damage. So why not just get super tanky, and if you can't kill yourself, the enemies probably can't kill you either. The need for defenses in all of these game modes is also why Champion has a much higher representation in hardcore and solo self-found than it does in softcore trade. Now, here's the full list of all the different options that people are playing as of 3.19. A lot of what we see here is more similar to what we'd see in trade week 1 or maybe week 2, with builds like Explosive Arrow and Poisonous Concoction remaining league start favorites. Of course, you've got some things in here like Seismic Trap, which is kind of a blast from the past at this point, Blade Vortex that's pretty much good in any league right now, and of course Fire Trap, because if you're going to be playing something like Righteous Fire, you're going to need Fire Trap for your single target. So nothing too surprising, although it is interesting that in hardcore trade Hex Blast is as popular as it is, making it right to the very bottom of the most meta builds list. Keep in mind, this isn't absolutely every build in Path of Exile, nor is it every build in softcore, solo self-found, or solo self-found hardcore. In fact, these aren't even all the builds in the game modes I'm talking about, but I did want to show that there is a difference in the metas, and we see something very interesting between them. In solo self-found, the build diversity curve is a lot more similar to softcore trade, but as you get to something like solo self-found hardcore, or even just hardcore trade, it actually becomes a lot more diverse. This is because people who are playing those game modes often aren't as worried about the meta, and I think one of the big reasons for this is your character doesn't get to stick around a lot. you're constantly pushed to try something new. And while you could pull a Pox and just make 5 different Righteous Fire builds on 5 different Ascendancies, from my experience, people would rather play 5 different things than play the same thing 5 different ways. But that's all down to personal preference, to be honest. Next, I did want to talk about some things that are a little bit different. Maybe something that changes your notions about what a hardcore build is. Before I do though, a quick reminder that if you found this helpful, maybe it's given you some ideas about how to pick a build in the future, be sure to leave a like and share it with a friend who's also interested in the meta. For more content, get subscribed. I post videos quite regularly. I recently went over an indie game Mandragora, and on my second channel, I talked about why class fantasy is both important and kind of irrelevant. Both of those videos will be in the card right now if you're interested. Before I get back to things, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. But more about how you can support at the end. For now, let's start looking at some specific builds. First up, we have a Cold Reap Inquisitor. The reason I wanted to talk about this build in particular is often when people think hardcore build, they think really tanky, really slow, and low damage. But if you invest enough into your character, much like in softcore trade, that really isn't the case. And this build is an excellent example of that because it's very well min-maxed. In fact, if you told me this was something being played in softcore trade, I'd probably believe you if I didn't see the context. The Cold Reap Inquisitor is specifically based off of what Dan played back in 3.18. It has extremely high damage due to leveraging leadership's price, and the fact that once converted to cold, or just in general, Reap has fairly high base damage. Brittle in particular is a very strong mechanic here, but remember you're also going to be sapping, which is effectively Fortify, and you're going to be scorching enemies. Something else that's very nice about this version is we look to be capping spell suppression. Capping spell suppression is an amazingly strong defensive layer that, while it is more difficult in 3.19, is certainly still attainable, especially if you have something like a Mageblood. I know that not everyone watching this will have a Mageblood, and you don't honestly need this level of defenses if you're not in hardcore. But I also wanted to show that players in hardcore do min-max builds, and do push them well beyond what people would normally consider the limit of a build. Sure, you probably already know that Dan and Waggle do, so part of the reason I'm highlighting this is to show that other people do play hardcore at a very high level. Something else that I quite like is the inclusion of the grand spectrums. You get power charges, endurance charges, and frenzy charges, which means you're going to be super tanky, it helps fix your crit, and it adds damage and cast speed. How would this feel to play? Well, if you've played any sort of self-cast Inquisitor, be it Spark, Blazing Salvo, or Reap, it's going to play pretty much like that. You can easily build all the defenses that you need, and you can get enough damage because you're able to abuse overlaps with things like Spell Cascade support. Though I will warn you that Reap does kind of have a dead zone if you cast it the wrong way, so it could lead to a somewhat frustrating experience if you don't know too much about the skill. And of course, like with many other self-cast Inquisitors, we do have the option to just permanently run Righteous Fire here. Sure, you'll be costing yourself a little bit of health, but you have so much recovery it really doesn't matter. This is why, in truth, every Inquisitor build is just an RF build in disguise. Now, we don't have an Aegis Aurora, but we do have 3% max cold res on the shield. This means you can actually do something very similar with Melting of the Flesh if you want to. And that's exactly what this build is doing. It's a very nice, perfect melding, -70, -4 all, probably not quite as good as it was in 3.18, but still a very good defensive layer that when combined with spell suppression will make you feel absurdly tanky against elemental damage, boss damage, and physical damage in general, since with 24,000 armor, the amount of fizz you're taking probably won't be all that high. Though, if this build did have one weakness, it probably would be fizz. Luckily, things like the endurance charges and the armor do fill most of those gaps. Next up, the solo self-found build, an Arc Trickster. Now, Lightning Conduit has gotten a lot of attention, and with good reason, but Arc isn't dead either. It's not going to be a super great single target skill. As you can see here, at 759k single target, I don't think this build is bursting down bosses in seconds, but 750k is probably more than enough for map bosses, especially in combination with Galvanic Field. Galvanic Field is kind of a super Orb of Storms, which was released in 3.19 as another shock scaling skill. It would certainly be a lot easier to build something like this on an Elementalist as opposed to a Trickster, but you can definitely do it on a Trickster, and you get a lot of really nice defensive benefits because a Trickster turns your evasion rating, at least on your chest piece, into energy shield. Then it turns your energy shield on your helmet into evasion rating. As a result, this build has around 5,000 life, 5,000 energy shield, and a juicy 26,000 evasion rating. In addition, it's abusing energy leech support, Personally, I didn't have too much success with this on my Shield Crush Trickster because between running Blood Rage and the fact that I only had around 2800 ES, it just wasn't enough. With around 5000 ES, I could actually see it being pretty good though. And something else to note here. This build's weakness is again physical damage. But if you want a mapper that's not necessarily super tanky, definitely clears very fast, and uses a fun new skill, I do think this could be a pretty good option. And because the build does have high evasion, and is running things like Tempest Shield, I don't think it would really feel like a glass cannon either. You just have to know what you can take hits from and what you can't take hits from. Finally, one interesting thing about builds that do lightning damage is they can go non-crit. This is an elemental overload build that uses non-crit strikes are lucky. Your lightning damage with non-crit strikes is lucky is a new archetype that was enabled with masteries. Before, you could technically do it, but it was a little bit more of a pain, especially in solo self-found, as it was enabled via a cluster jewel. Now you have the option to play a non-crit lightning build, which is especially helpful for lightning spells that tend to have a very wide damage range. It's still helpful, but less impactful for attacks, as attacks tend to have a damage range based on your weapon, which in general is a little bit tighter. Then finally, for solo self-found hardcore, a Spectral Helix champion. If I had to pick any build that I personally would play in a gauntlet setting, it would be a Spectral Helix champion. Champion offers you very easy defenses that you don't have to scale. They kind of just scale themselves, or in the case of Fortified, it just works. Spectral Helix is something that you can pick up and use while leveling that continues all the way into the endgame. And you don't really need to pay too much attention to having a good weapon. Really, throw on any old two-hand that's somewhat decent and you're good to go. After all, if you compare this to a lot of softcore trade weapons, this is far from impressive, but it's more than enough for a smooth mapping experience and for killing many bosses. I don't think that killing bosses in solo self-found hardcore should necessarily be easy. The entire point of a game mode is to limit yourself. Something else that I like about this setup is it's using the Elevore helmet. The Elevore helmet is quite nice because it adds a layer of recovery when you suppress enemy spell damage. So if a bunch of enemies in your map hit you with a bunch of spells and don't hit you very hard, you'll feel pretty immortal. Furthermore, it's much easier to cap your spell suppression when using a helmet that has 23% of it. This is quite important since it's harder to get spell suppression on gear anymore. Instead, you'll have to get it on the tree. Now I know when people think champion, they very often think adrenaline abuse, but that's not something this build is doing. And I wanted to highlight a build that isn't doing it, specifically to show that you don't have to do adrenaline abuse if you're going to play champion. It's perfectly acceptable to go inspirational, master of metal, and fortitude. And if you're in solo self-found hardcore, remember every time you take yourself down to low life to get that adrenaline proc is a chance that you risk death. Though if I found something like the Death Rush unique ring, I'd probably switch inspirational over, because then I could get all of the bonus effects of adrenaline without actually having to knock myself to low life. This is also the sort of build that would scale very well with perseverance. You don't absolutely need it. In fact, this player got to level 98 without it, but if you happen to find it, it would be quite nice. When you're looking at solo self-found hardcore builds or gauntlet builds, it's always nice to have things where you don't specifically need items. Even Elevore isn't mandatory. It's certainly great, but it's not mandatory. And from there, you'd want to scale your damage with just really simple stuff like a weapon, and, well, a weapon. That's pretty much all that Spectral Helix needs. Of course, you don't have to be a Fizz Spectral Helix two-handed champion. Instead, you could play it on a Raider, you could play it on a Trickster, you could play it on an Assassin. It's an incredibly versatile build, and I do think that the Raider, Trickster, and even a Slayer variant would all potentially be viable in solo self-found hardcore. It would just come down to your own experience with a skill and your own experience building characters. So those are some of my thoughts on the hardcore trade, solo self-found, and solo self-found hardcore metas in Path of Exile 3.19. Normally, this is about the time where I'd be talking about gauntlet builds, but unfortunately we're not going to have a gauntlet this time around. When it comes to looking at builds, I think it's always important to remember what the build was made for. After all, if you try to kill uber bosses on something like a dedicated darkness farmer from Delve, it's going to feel pretty bad, and rightly so. Some builds are generalists. They're made to do most if not all content in the game. But other builds are specialists, and that's totally fine. But it's also important to remember that you should always base your builds in strong mechanical synergies. And if you want to know how strong mechanical synergies work, after this, perhaps check out my video on how resistances work in Path of Exile. I've seen a lot of people die to things this league that they easily could have prevented by having slightly higher resistances. That'll again be in the card if you want to check it out. But for now, I only have one question. Have you ever played solo self-found hardcore or solo self-found hardcore? And if so, did you enjoy the experience? Maybe you jumped in on a gauntlet, or you did it during one of the events, such as Endless Delve, which was solo self-found only. Personally, I haven't done hardcore in years, and while I did do a little bit of solo self-found for the events, it really wasn't my cup of tea. For me, the best part about Path of Exile is being able to buy 1,000 fossils and crafting something just for the sake of crafting it. Or thinking of something like, wouldn't it be cool if I just played an Inquisitor, and being able to smoothly level it without any fuss. But different people play the game for different reasons, so I'm curious about your thoughts and experiences. Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.